All right, so this week, I just released this week's session. I went ahead and started putting week 2 up here just to keep people and organized. So week 2, pre-engagement activities. At the top, you'll always have an overview that kind of tells you what to do. So in this case, there's going to be...
First main section of penetration testing is the pre-engagement interaction.
Not that.
This is an extremely important part of the testing process as it outlines what is.
Okay, sorry about that. So the idea here is that you'll go through, follow along with these. This week, like I said, is primarily some reading materials, but things we need to get out of the way first, as you would perform these when you first meet with a client that you're doing a penetration test for. So to get started, the first thing we're going to talk about is this pre-engagement section, and this is out here on the pen test standard. Essentially, the first thing we're going to go through is introduction to the scope and defining the scope. It's arguably the most important step and component of a penetration test, and often the most overlooked. The idea being that you need to have constraints as to what you're doing, what you're allowed to do. The scope of the self defines what is to be tested, what is not to be tested. We'll also cover a little bit more within the rules of engagement as well. So you can define some different pricing structures. It's all really good reading material here to have a better understanding. Again, at the end of this course, you guys will have a capture the flag style of event, but you guys will be writing a report, and that will be this pen testing assessment. And you guys will kind of outline a statement of work and all of that we're going to cover in here. So scope meeting, you guys, again, just kind of read through these. The main thing I wanted to draw attention to today was going through these general questions. Each one of these is basically a setup for the type of things that you're going to be contracted to do. So if you're doing a network penetration test, these are the types of questions that you would want to ask. Same thing with web application and a few others. Now, is that the only questions? No, these are just the recommended ones based on the standard that's out there. Scope creep is probably the biggest thing that will hurt most of your little businesses and firms. And the idea there is that you're not staying efficient. So if you start constantly making your scope bigger and not defined or rechanging that every week when you go to do a pen test, you're going to run into struggles. Does everybody kind of understand scope creep as a whole? Again, they're going to, request additional work while you're out in the middle of a project, and you just can't do that because you're going to be spending extra money. They're going to refuse to pay for that extra work, and it's never worth staying on that. So they're like, oh, since you're testing it, can't you just test my website too? Sure, we'll charge it. They don't want to keep charged, right? Setting specific start and end dates. Don't let it run on forever. This is also going to help you as far as risk, making sure that you're only doing tests within a certain time frame and that you have a delivery date for your report. There's a bunch of stuff that goes in there as far as specific IP ranges and domains, how to deal with third parties, including cloud services, the internet service provider, as well as any managed security service providers as well. They may ask you to do things like social engineering pretexts. So if they want you to go and pretend to be somebody else or create a bunch of spam and see how many of the clients or their employees actually click on the links and perform the different things to see who would get that type of email. So we do a similar type thing here at Fort Hays all the time, whether they engineer some of that as a test or whether we get flagged as a bunch of people emulating to be somebody else or intimidating somebody else. And then they click on it. They think it, for example, the department chair, Melissa, I get emails about once every other week of somebody pretending to be her, asking for a quick phone call, asking for a quick number, similar to things that she would say. She walks by in the hallway there. And if you're in a hurry and not thinking about it, you respond to that email. So one, it validates your email address. Two, they could probably collect some information. They assume that you're the boss and that you'll just answer it blindly without paying attention as to who sent the email. And most of the time, it's usually some weird Gmail account that was created for the purpose. In the context of this penetration testing, that's the kind of stuff that you guys would create. So you may create your own spam email addresses, and that comes into the social engineers toolkit. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And we have some labs about that. Collecting enough information so that you can create your own spam to try to see if somebody will let you into the company. You may also do some denial of service testing, whether that's direct denial of service or if you use a distributed model in order to attack things. Pay attention on your payment terms. This is one of the things that's often overlooked. Most people are just the techies and they don't think about the business side of things. But if you're going to be doing penetration testing, you should get paid. And just like normal contracts, there should be specific dates, payment terms. Larger organizations, tend to want net 30 type things or net 90 type payments, which basically means the total amounts due within 30 days. If it goes any longer than that, then you can start charging interest or you can start charging late fees, etc. It's not uncommon for most people to want half their stuff up front. You may have a reoccurring payment from there on out, or if you're using long-term engagements where they're having you test different projects in the future, you could set those up as well. At the end of the day, you want to have your goals, and this is the basic concept behind penetration tests. So you have your primary goal, and it should not necessarily be driven by any kind of compliance. For example, PCI, DSS, making sure that your PII information is protected, personal identifiable information. You should have some secondary goals related to the compliance, but there may be other things in there. And then a business analysis, kind of testing what vulnerabilities would be in the network and what you're wanting to test. As far as establishing lines of communication, making sure that you can approach them, how they want to be talked to, establishing any emergency contact. So if you guys are testing this in the evening or you find a major vulnerability, for example, when we talk about the discussion board this week, is who would you talk to? Who would you report any major outages or incidents or something like that to? As an incident definition, we'll talk a little bit about NIST. If you're not familiar with NIST, that is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and it's a pretty big rule book if you've ever seen it before. It's massive. Costs about a tree every time you print it. As far as all these other reports, we'll talk about rules of engagement, and this is going to be the timeline. So when you can perform the test, is it during hours? Is it after hours? The location of this given test, are you going to do it over VPN? Are you going to do it on site? Is there certain things that you find along the way? For example, they're talking about child pornography being discovered. Do you notify the law enforcement officials directly? Do you talk with them? Now you get into the ethics side of things. So when you're doing penetration tests on different companies or on a private organization, if you come across things that are illegal, for example, child pornography, etc., do you report it to the end user or do you report it directly to the authorities? And while we're on that, I mean, that is one of the biggest things that you'll find as we're going through here. We talk a little bit about it in this course. We talk a little bit more about it, especially in like digital forensics, because that course will cover how to recover data like that. And for the most part, that's what forensic investigators are seeing day in, day out. But you may find something else. You may find different types of corporate espionage. So you're finding intellectual property that's not that company's, that's somebody else's company, that they were able to pull patent rights or something like that, or designs or something in between. If you come across that, what do you do? So that's all in your rules of engagement in terms of evidence handling. Whether you're handing out USB sticks and trying to get people to plug them in their machines, get some of decent size that people actually want the devices, that kind of thing. Let's see, regular status meetings and time of day, being able to have permission to test, and then obviously any legal considerations. You don't want to be capturing things like VoIP calls and things like that, maybe considered wiretapping in some areas. Even if you're just doing a Wireshark of network traffic that's going through there, you're obviously capturing those packets. So a whole breadth of that information. What I'm looking for is that you just kind of read through it, be familiar with it. We talk a little bit about threat modeling, and this is basically addressing or assessing who is the threats for the particular company that you're trying to do a pen test for. So a lot of times they'll talk about SWOT analysis. If you're not familiar with SWOT, it's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And a lot of companies do this all the time, even certain organizations. We do it as a department. We do a SWOT analysis all the time. As you're working through here, and we're talking about business assets, I'm not going to cover this one in as great a detail, but you want to have an idea if you're going to be dealing with a bigger organization, or if this is your goal is to be a pen tester or hold a pen test firm, you should be very familiar with all this information in here. Particularly looking through a business process. So you got to think of it not as just the person with a Kali Linux box and you're going to go in and start attacking. It doesn't work that way in the real world. You actually have to go through business practices, find out what their different processes for analysis so that you're not taking down any business that's inside of there. Obviously, services are up and running. Do you clone those? Do you let your employees know that somebody's going to be on the network? Are you waiting to find out if they find that somebody's on the network? That's the kind of outlines that you're going to have as you're working through here. Anybody have any questions at this point? Okay. In terms of threat capability, like I said, just kind of move through here. We talked a little bit about this today in my undergrad class, is really understanding the motivation behind somebody hacking. Very, very rarely is it somebody that just wants to hack your system, right? There's usually some motivation for them to want to attack you. So whether it's directly for profit, so they're trying to capture your data, encrypt it, do something like malware where they can take your data, encrypt it, and then charge Bitcoin or some other cryptocurrency so that they're untraceable. It may be based on hacktivism, which is something that would be, anonymous is probably the best one that most people are familiar with in terms of hacktivism. Some direct grudge could be a disgruntled employee. It could be somebody that got passed over for a promotion, etc. Those are the kind of things you have to look on the inside. You also have the kids out there that are just doing it for fun or trying to gain a reputation, script kiddies. Those are probably the worst threat of all of them because they're just running random scripts against your network. And there's so many out there on the internet now where they don't have to have any knowledge or skills. They just have to know how to run some of the tools. A lot of tools today are very, very automated, so to speak. You put in an IP address and hit go, and it will do everything for you. When we start talking and outlining how to do the different vulnerabilities and things like that, core impact, if you guys have never heard of that, that is like having a Kali Linux suite that is the go-to for most pen testers. Very, very expensive. I got to play with it. Man, it's been almost 15 years ago now. That was a one click. You walk in a network, plug in an Ethernet cable, hit one button, and it scans the entire network, starts accessing all the different threats and vulnerabilities, opens up shells on every single system that's available on the network, and you just sit there at a console and start going nuts. Awesome. It was very, very awesome to play with. Yeah, it's like watching a movie when you were playing with Core Impact. It's pretty crazy. And that's just it. A lot of tools, even in Kali today, a lot of tools are automated. You give it an IP address, you tell it the type of attack you want, it starts hammering away. You have things like Metasploit and those now that are automated, way easier than they used to be back in the day. You can start doing multiple vulnerability attacks, etc. All right. So that gets us through those first two there. One we'll take a look at this PowerPoint here. And this is one I just kind of roughly made up here a while back. So methodologies for the scope. You have a black box, white box, gray box. A black box is going to be in terms of methodology. It's no company confidential knowledge is available to the tester other than what is legally required to define and limit the scope. So this will force the pen test team to gather knowledge using creative methods and sources prior to what's being conducted. So this particular style of test is, you don't get anything into our network. We want you to try to attack us and see what you get. So they may be using creative methods like spam and email, USB drives dropped in the parking lot, in the front lobby, chatting up somebody in the organization and pretending to be somebody you're not, that kind of thing. That's the type of test that this particular one is talking about. You don't really have any inside knowledge whatsoever. In a white box methodology, pen testers will have full access to the internal knowledge. So this allows the pen test to have an insider knowledge of the organization's network assets, policies, and procedures. This method may provide credentials for scanning and allowing company personnel to be interviewed or answer questions prior to the engagement. So the idea being that you say, okay, here's our IP address block, here's everything else. You want them to do an audit of more sorts versus nobody knows you're coming and see what you can do to get in, kind of thing. And then obviously you have the gray box. So you get a little bit of company confidential knowledge. It's available to the tester, like schematics, but no real source code. This kind of testing combines those elements where the pen test may have knowledge of one area, but need to do conductive investigative research in areas prior to or during the engagement. In terms of types of assessments, again, we talked a little bit about goals-based, objective-based, as well as compliance and red team themselves. So in a goals-based or an objective-based assessment, it's going to attempt to evaluate the security within an organization through a simulated cyber attack. I need to fix that there. Each objective or goal provides general information or instruction for a given test scenario. So for example, administrative access to production database servers. In a compliance test, this is where you're going to audit an organization's ability to follow and implement a given set of security standards within an environment. This is probably one of the most common ones today that people will get sent through. So trying to do PCI compliance, if you guys are taking any kind of payment cards, you have HIPAA violations or HIPAA accountability. You have Federal Information Security Management Act. You may have medical records if you're dealing with hospitals, et cetera, that you're required to protect. In a red team assessment, this is going to kind of evaluate how well you know an organization and the fair amount of scenario given in a real world attack. It involves a stealth or a blend type of methodology between network penetration as well as social engineering. And those goals are tested from time to time for detection, time to the response, resilience against the model threats, using tactics not limited to a single scope. So essentially, if you're a red team, they're trying to figure out how quickly did somebody on our network realize you're trying to attack us, whether that be through network penetration or social engineering. At what point did somebody identify something was off and that somebody's trying to acquire data? Threat modeling, we just talked about threat modeling a little bit ago, but it's a complex process that takes a structured approach to identify, quantify, and address the risks associated with a given organization's information system. So that pen testing standard is going to define threat modeling as a process to ensure mutual understanding of what's important between the testee and the tester, including understanding risk appetite, threat emulation, as well as relevant goal setting between those. And so there's a couple different models you can use. This here is Microsoft's model. So you'll start by identifying those assets, describe the architecture or the organization, kind of decompose whatever application you're against, identify threats, document the threats, then rate the threats. So before you ever start hacking into a box, this is the kind of stuff that you have to do. You want to analyze who would be attacking so that I can think like the attacker, right? It's it seems common knowledge, but this is just taking it to the nth degree, because most of what you do as a pen tester is the report, right? It's not you jumping in and say, oh, I found this IP address and this had an SSH that used a unsecure password. Okay, that's a footnote in your report. The report's going to say, here's the outline of the structure. Here's who I think your attackers are going to be, moving on forward down the line. And that's what people get paid for. All right, threat actors. We've talked about these now. Target selection. I think we've gone after this. For the internal side, you may be going after SSIDs or passwords on the Wi-Fi network, having an IP address whitelisted. May give you access to Active Directory and privilege level assets. On an external target, this is going to have more limited attack vectors. So this is outside the security parameter. In other words, you're not in the company's organization. So you're going to have to use OSINT. And so OSINT, if you guys haven't heard this is open source intelligence gathering. And it is a complete art form. I've seen this time and time again at DEF CON. There's entire workshops and areas dedicated to doing open source intelligence gathering. You may spend weeks doing open source intelligence gathering before you ever do the attack. The idea is the more information you have about the network, the more information you have about the company, who it is, and what you're going to attack, the better off you can pick different vectors without getting caught. It's the whole goal, right? We just talked about the time to recognize there's an issue. The more research you do ahead of time, the less chance you have of somebody recognizing. If you know the logs get rotated every minute, but by the time it gets sent from the server over to somebody else, or you're watching somebody, just like what you see in the movies, right? Ocean's 11 or whatever you want to call it. You see somebody's routine, you know how quickly they're moving the chips from the platform back to the vault and everything else. You look for the loopholes in between there, the times when you're not seen on camera, etc. Same concept when you're doing a penetration test. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about contractual agreements. So contractual agreements, we have an NDA. If you guys haven't heard that, that's your non-disclosure agreement. You have an MSA, which is your master service agreement, and then your SAW, your statement of work. Those are the three main agreements or paperworks that you're typically going to fill out when you're doing a pen test. So in a non-disclosure agreement, an NDA, it's basically just going to protect the business from competitive advantage by protecting its proprietary information. If you guys signed up with any companies, you more than likely were asked to sign an NDA, or if you work with a governmental organization, you're definitely going to have to sign some NDAs. Your MSA or your master service agreement, the NDA is just an overarching contract between two parties, but your master service agreement is going to set up all your conditions. So payment terms, warranties, intellectual property ship on the ownership, dispute resolution, allocation of risk, and indemnification. So those MSAs are typically used in the field, tend to be open-ended, and support an organization's functional areas like manufacturing, sales, accounting, finance. You could be doing an audit on just about anything, right? It's not just a server farm. You may be very well doing something like a manufacturing plant in Hayes kind of thing. And while some of those seem minimal, for example, the sewer system here in Hayes, last I knew, the systems that were on that were very old, very, very old systems. And they ran very old PLC controllers. Well, it's no different than Stuxnet, right? Something where they wrote viruses for the nuclear reactors. There's nothing stopping me writing viruses that would go into those PLC controllers. They were still running on Windows XP or earlier because the new software doesn't run kind of thing. A lot of times people run those as virtual machines, etc. Well, you know, there's a ton of vulnerabilities for that. If you can work your way into it, you can infect the entire network. Now I can start shutting off sewer systems. I can start shutting off water systems and really affecting the grid in Hayes. All right, that SAL, which is that statement of work, this is going to be your formal document that routinely employs a field project. So it's really kind of project management. Again, it's going to state your purpose, scope of work, location of it, period of performance. In other words, how often are you going to report your findings, your deliverable schedule from when you start to where you deliver the final report, any applicable industry standards that may need to be apparent in this, acceptance, special requirements, and obviously a payment schedule. You want to get paid. Notice that there's sometimes some overlap between the master service agreement. So there's 3 main documents. They're kind of overlapping. It's the paperwork of what you guys are trying to create. The rules of engagement is probably the most important one in terms of you guys actively doing the test. And this is going to put in the guidelines and constraints as to what you can and cannot do. So is brute force allowed? Are brute force counts limited by password lockout policies? Automated fuzzing and manual exploitation, that kind of stuff. That rule of engagement can be treated as part of the SAL or a completely separate document, however you want to build it out. All right. In this contractual agreements down here, you're going to see examples of each one of these. These are random ones that I kind of grabbed off the internet, but they're all applicable. So the idea here is that you could get an idea of what a rule of engagement looks like versus a statement of work. And a lot of times these are actual agreements that I found out on the internet. So you guys can kind of review those, know what to make one look like. All right, Hurricane Labs. This is a good video. I'm going to play this here.
Welcome to penetration testing, the Hurricane Labs way. I'm Bill Matthews, and I'm here to discuss with you the way
I'll let you guys go ahead and finish this out, but hopefully you got the gist of it. Right here, Hurricane Labs is describing what they do different than everybody else. But to me, the concepts that you needed to pull out of there is that they do assess a bank versus different than a hospital or different than a mom and pop coffee shop down the street kind of thing. So depending on who your client is going to justify the different level of attacks. You don't just walk in and do a core impact on a coffee house. Why? Kind of thing, right? What you're going to be more worried about is probably the Wi-Fi. Is the Wi-Fi secure, right? They're a coffee house. That's what most people go to a coffee house and use is the Wi-Fi. Is that separate than the physical network? Can you breach between the two of those? You're taking credit card information. Is that PCI data going across the same network as the Wi-Fi? Can I watch credit card numbers get sent across the network? So there's little things that you would look for differently than, say, a manufacturing plant or what they may look for out in the network, controllers, that kind of stuff. They talked about the generic testing. You guys will actually go through some of those testers. So OpenVAS is a pretty big one. OpenVAS, Nessus used to be pretty huge. Now they've gotten to the point where you got to pay for subscriptions and signs on those, and they're never cheap because that's what people were doing. They would sign up to all the community stuff that was out there for free from all these different tools. They would run a report, slap a logo on it, and charge you $1,000. Nothing more than what you could have downloaded Kali Linux and ran against yourself kind of thing. But it's a good start. It's not that it's a negative thing, but it's something you guys could be doing internally if you manage a network. So when I used to work for a company before I came here, that's what I did. Every new application we released, or if we did an update to a server or something else, we at least ran a standard test against it to see what open ports were out there. Was there vulnerabilities on those given ports? Was it in depth? Not every single time, no, but we'd run a 1-hour scan or whatever it took every single time to make sure that we didn't do a duh and leave port 22 wide open to the world or something silly. All right. Last thing I wanted to talk about today is the code of ethics. So this is from EC Council. I got to ask all the tools that I'm going to be training you on and things you're going to be doing in this class. Please follow a good code of ethics. And then what's in here? Don't go take this to the business that you work in. Don't go take this down to the coffee shop and start hacking people. Be smart about it. Because if the FBI comes knocking on my door asking me why this student's doing what, I don't know that student. That student was their own responsibility. You guys can train on the internet just as fast as you can train in this classroom. I'm just trying to help you do it in a structured way. And I will give you guys environments that do not get the FBI calling and knocking on your door versus you scanning Fort Hayes or the networks and things in between there. You guys are welcome to do these scans and things that we learn on your own home networks. I encourage you to do that. You should do an open vulnerability scan on your network to see what's out there. Why? How many Internet of Things have you lit up in your house in the last year? Whether you have Ring doorbells or sensors somewhere, light bulbs with Wi-Fi signals, there's all sorts of stuff. You guys have probably enabled things that you weren't thinking could be hacked, and they're out there and available for people to jump in. One of the biggest things I did when I was in my undergrad for my capstone was I drove every single street in Hayes. And at the time, to recap, I worked for the Next Tech Internet Help Desk, right? We were deploying wireless routers at everybody's house so that they would have wireless access. It was in the early days of this. Signal-wise, you only had B and G at the time. You didn't really have N and all these other frequencies and channel hopping. So if you know anything about wireless, you know that on B and G, it primarily uses channels 1, 6, and 11. There's channels in between there, but it doesn't really matter because those are the only non-overlapping channels. Well, when we deployed these at Next Tech, the techs were just deploying these routers however they saw fit. There was no rhyme or reason as to why they would use WEP or whether they would use WPA was just coming out. WPA2 didn't exist at the time. And so what a lot of them were doing was using WEP, and they were using the customer's telephone numbers as the passwords. Why? Because that was the easiest thing for customers to remember. It was also the easiest for things to go through and test stuff. Obviously, there's a lot of wrong things with using the telephone number for the passwords. Unfortunately, some places still do this type of thing today. But it wasn't just Nextech. Eagle was deploying a bunch at the time that was here local. So my goal was to do an audit of all the access points that existed within the city of Hayes. One, find out how many access points were out there. Two, I could figure out the make and models of these so I could determine what was the makeup in this town. At the time, you had the Linksys WRT54G was the king of all the routers. That's just it's what everybody had. It's what Nextech deployed. It's what Eagle deployed. If you went down to Walmart, that's what you grabbed. That's what was there. So the idea was to do a scan, find out where all these different locations are, figure out coverage areas, signal overlap, so that we could better train the techs to say, okay, do a scan in this area, realize that you have some on channel 1, some on channel 6, some on channel 11. If you have a ton of interference, switch to a different channel line. Don't just go from 6 to 7. That does nothing. That doesn't change anything because those signals overlap. So if you go to your 1, 6, and 11s, we got them to stop doing WEP and go to something like WPA, which we had at the time. Again, WPA2 didn't exist. And then I would set up rogue access points around town, showing how quickly and easily I could break into WEP, how quickly and easily I could break into WPA and still capture all your information on the inside. So that was all part of a graduate capstone project. The goal was to get Nextech to fund training so that we could change the different technicians' deployments. And we were able to do that. By the time I left Nextech, I had gone to R&D, and that was the last thing I was doing, was training technicians to do this all the same across the entire company. Because some people would do it here in Hayes, but if you're not familiar with Nextech as a local ISP, they covered the western half of Kansas at the time. And every town did something different. You had a couple techs in every town. They did it different in every single town. They also had fiber, they had cable, they had wireless, they had DSL, ASDN lines, they had dial-up connections still at the time, all these different forms of internet service. So everybody did it differently within the houses. So the goal was to get it, 1, uniform, and 2, make sure we were actually protecting our customers. WPA was not the answer. It was at least better than WEP though. Okay. Now, well, the reason I mentioned that was because back to code of ethics, we had to have a code of ethics as we were doing all these scans, that we weren't going to be attacking people in Hayes. The purpose here was to do the research and figure out what type of routers were being used, what type of encryptions were being used, that type of thing. Yes, we're collecting data, but we're not doing it in a nefarious way. We're just collecting and listening to radio signals, basically. And so we built, at first, it was just basically driving around with a laptop, capturing wireless signals. Then to do it correctly, I custom built a router that had multiple wireless antennas that could detect channels A, B, G, N, and we had 3 or 4 radios for each one. The more radios we deployed and driving up every single street, I could actually map out in Google Earth at the time approximately the locations of the access points and their coverage areas based on the signals and the signal strength that we were seeing. And it was all GPS mapped out. So it was a really cool project. I'll cover a little bit of that in the wireless hacking section that we do in here. I have a video from last year. But the idea there is that you guys maintain some kind of code of ethics as you're working through here. If it's on your home network, shouldn't matter, as long as it's your home network. All right, the other thing you have this week is chapter 1. Please go out and fill out this thread. Click on create thread, create your own thread. The idea behind this is a particular company's having an issue. So if we go look at the discussion board, you can see here the outline for this scenario. I'm looking for a 1 to 2 paragraph to those questions. You don't have to respond to other people's. You're more than welcome to do that if you want to, but it's not a requirement. So this was something I got from DEF CON 27 when I was out there in their ethics village, and exactly what would you do? And it raised from the crowd, and I thought it was a really good exercise because there was a lot of people having a lot of different opinions in there. and there wasn't necessarily the right opinion, but you would see the point of view of a bunch of different people. And that's the whole point of this discussion board. And yes, this was a real event that happened that somebody was trying to get people to comprehend at DEF CON. So it's not just a completely made up, that would never happen kind of thing. It was a real thing. And they were under this dilemma of what they're going to do. All right. No labs this week, nothing else. It's basically just the reading material that you have in week 2 here. Really understand these contractual agreements, go back through these different presentations, read through these documents, that kind of thing. There probably won't be a recording on Wednesday. We'll meet here for those of you guys that are here, but we probably won't record anything or hold the WebEx session for those of you that are attending the WebEx. We probably won't hold a WebEx session on Wednesday because it's mostly just reading at this point. Now, starting next week, we start playing with the intro tools is the next step in the process. So right now you're going through all the contractual agreements, the pre-engagements of what you're going to do. The next step as we start to move forward is going to be the getting to know your target section. So now we're starting to understand what we're going to do. We've outlined everything. We've got our contracts in play. They hired us. Now we got to go figure out who our client is. Let's see here. I'm going to stop this share. I saw some chat comes up there. The sound contract links are broken under contractual agreements. Thanks, Sam. Let's give me a second here to look at those. That's what happens when you use internet links. Yeah, it looks like those links died. What I would suggest doing is going out and actually doing some research. See if you guys can find an example of a statement of work for a penetration test, a non-disclosure agreement, some master service ones. Unfortunately, these weren't PDFs at the time, so I couldn't necessarily download those, but I think I have some backup copies there. Thanks for letting me know that, Sam.
All right. Sure, we can go to the internet machine and
yeah, I mean, that's honestly what I did here was I just did a Google search for these different type of agreements, try to find ones that are relevant to penetration tests. There's a ton of them out there. The very first time I taught this, I used to just have people go out and do that kind of thing, right? Just go find out what contracts you could find. This was a result of that. I grabbed some from a bunch of different students and posted the links out here. This one here, I think, was one that was done for the Washington State Court. They obviously don't show it anymore, kind of thing. It was an old draft.
Oh, I would love to see that.
This contract here.
Yeah, with the Washington State Court, yes.
It was an old document. I'm sure you could find it. But they did a procurement to do a penetration test against the appellate courts. So. I'll do some digging and see if I can't find it.
I did have a secondary question. If we already answered the chapter 1 discussion board, but so I couldn't find a way to edit it. And I'm curious if there's ways to edit our discussion postings before they're quote due finalized. Is there any like stopgap or like a, hey, you can edit up to this point, or is it just a you can edit or not edit? It's been a while since I've administered Blackboard courses.
I'm okay with you editing or doing whatever you want. There we go. I just needed to click a checkbox that said allowed to edit.
Oh, okay. Because I had not addressed one item and I responded to someone else just to cover it. But also now that I'm noticing I'm a week ahead, I was like, oh, there's more to say.
Yeah, no, that's no problem. Evidently, when I did the import this time, I didn't save those settings. Normally, that's exactly what I allow. So
I found the document, the Washington State document referring to. I used the archive.org.
there you go. What's that? Yeah, archive.org, and then or you use the Wayback Machine, one or the other. Yeah.
So I'll email it to you if you want to post
Perfect.
a PDF.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll replace those documents in there. I think at one point I had the official documents and then I realized that I didn't necessarily have permissions for those. So I just did the links and then now I don't think it matters. So. Anybody have any questions over today? I believe I'm still recording. Yeah, good.
So is that chapter one, that's the first discussion. As far as the life.
Yeah. Yep. And there's no right or wrong answers in it, right? I'm just looking at, did you do the 1 to 2 paragraph response? That's the requirement. There is no, you have to answer this. It's just,
Is there basically information out there as far as circumstances?
what I'm more asking about is if you ran the company, what would you do? Yep. If you ran this penetration test and you came across this situation, what would you do?
But I mean, question, is there information out there as far as like those circumstances, this is the proper channel?
I mean, the intention there is that it boils back to the statement of work and it boils back to the MSA. Right? So the idea here is that you would want some kind of information in your MSA. You would want something in your statement of work, your rules of engagement, that kind of documentation. That's why it's important, because if you come across something like this, what do you do? And that's the whole purpose behind this discussion board, is that those random documents that I've just been talking about for an hour, they're not random documents. They're important because it will take nothing for you to find child pornography, or maybe you find this, bunch of life machines at a hospital. If you reboot them, do they shut off? Do they not shut off? Do you test the vulnerability? Do you not test the vulnerability? Right. And there again, do you feel comfortable doing that? Do you have it in your rules of engagement that you do not do anything on live equipment? But if their boss, if whatever CISO of this hospital says, no, I want you to test, I want to know if it's vulnerable or not. Exactly. That's the whole point of this scenario is what happens if they die? Are you responsible, or is the hospital responsible because you're contracted through them? You would want that kind of stuff in your statement of work and your master service agreement. But there again, do you need something like that if you're advertising for a bank, if you're doing a pen testing for a bank? Completely different scenario, right? Or a manufacturing or a hospital. That's the whole point, is to kind of sit there and realize that everything's different. Not one MSA fits all kind of thing. Or if you did, it would be very ugly and the client would want to know, why are you talking about life machines? I just want you to test my coffee house. Which, the life machine may very well be the coffee machine.
Yeah.
Depends on where you're at. All right. Are you guys able to follow along okay for those that are jumping in the WebExes every time?
Yep.
Okay, good. Were you guys able to hear the audio from that video when I played it?
I had to play it locally.
Okay, I realized that I meant to mute my microphone and not mute the actual audio. So sorry about that.
Yeah, I knew I'd still watch it. So I was like, okay, I'll watch this, later. And the only thing is you couldn't hear any of the student audience questions. So
Yes, I have a solution for that. So I forgot to click the right button here on my microphone. So from here on out, we should be able to pick up them from way back. Can one of you guys talk?
Yeah.
Can you hear them now?
but yeah, that's a lot better.
Okay. Austin, can you say a pretty sentence for me?
Yeah, you turn the gain up on that for us all the way over here.
Is that better for you guys online?
Yeah, that's pretty loud.
Yep.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. I bumped that switch from the other class. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and end this recording.